Hello everybody, welcome back to part 3 of the Civil War presentation. Today we're going to start with military leadership, and we're going to lead all the way up to the 7 Days Battle, which will get us to the fourth part of this video. Let's get started. We're going to talk about some generals. Now, these generals are a little bit different in the two groups of generals that we're going to see. So this first group that you're going to see, Lincoln's generals, this is going to be kind of in an order of who is in charge at what time. This is going to be an ongoing problem for Lincoln, is that he gets military leaders, but the military leaders aren't doing exactly what he wants them to do. So we start out with Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott is also called Old Fuss and Feathers. By the time that the Civil War starts, he's been in charge for 20 years. And he's literally too fat and too old to get on his horse or even really walk around much. Like, it's a problem. Lincoln actually goes to him at one point and says, how's the troops? Where are they stationed? And Scott says, I don't know. They've stopped updating me. Well, who stopped updating him? Well, in some cases, it's Irwin McDowell. Irwin McDowell's the guy that takes over, and Irwin McDowell is actually the guy that goes to the first, shooting at each other in a field battle, the Battle of Bull Run. Irwin McDowell, by all accounts, is a doer. He does, but his plans aren't always the best. Kind of. He's not very successful in his short stint as commander of the army. He's also undermined by a guy who it seems like all he does is plan, the third guy, George McClellan. George McClellan is very well respected by his troops. A lot of people really like George McClellan, but I can guarantee you no one likes George McClellan more than George McClellan. George McClellan thinks that George McClellan is the bee's knees, and George McClellan thinks that George McClellan can do no wrong. But Lincoln decides that he needs to replace George McClellan with someone even better looking, Ambrose Burnside. Ambrose Burnside, by all accounts, he's just unlucky. I mean, look at that head. Do I need to say more? No, he has plans, but it seems like anytime he tries to execute a plan, either it's denied by the people above him, Secretary of War, Lincoln himself, or he's a victim of circumstance where he goes to march to a place and maybe it's poured down rain and it's super muddy, and his men would get there and they'd be exhausted from having to trample through the mud. He just seems to be unlucky. You know who wasn't unlucky is the next guy, Joseph Hooker. Joseph Hooker is known as a very temperamental. He drinks a lot of celery juice and very popular with the ladies kind of guy. You can look up more about Joseph Hooker and his extent of being a general in the war. As a matter of fact, below this in the scooter parking, I'm going to put a link to the generals that Lincoln has. It's pretty interesting to click through. After Joseph Hooker, we get George Meade, who takes over 2 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. Lincoln says, I suppose he can defend his own dung hill. George Meade is not as well respected by the troops as somebody like a George McClellan. As a matter of fact, they call him a goggle-eyed snapping turtle. George Meade does something, though, that's pretty respectable. He wins Gettysburg, and he sends Lincoln a message saying, I've driven him out of Pennsylvania. And Lincoln says, go after him. Go fight him. He actually says, if you don't go after them, you're fired. But if you do go after them, I think we win this war. So George Meade gets fired, and we get McClellan. For a very short amount of time, McClellan takes over again. And once he's fired, we get Ulysses S. Grant. Now, the Confederate generals are in a slightly different setting. These are one after another. The Confederate generals are all going to be serving at the same time, with the last one being in charge of all of them. So we have Thomas Stonewall Jackson, George Pickett, who we'll talk about in Gettysburg, James Longstreet, who I'm not saying that Stonewall Jackson and Longstreet are the same person. I've never seen them in the same room together, though. Nathan Bedford Forrest, very good cavalryman, also very racist, first Grand Wizard of the KKK. Jeb Stuart, James Ewell Brown Stuart. Now, I'm not saying that Jeb Stuart and James Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson are the same guy. I'm just saying I've never seen them in the same room together at the same time. And we have Robert E. Lee. What's interesting is, at the beginning of the war, Robert E. Lee owns 0 slaves. But you don't know who does own slaves? Ulysses S. Grant. In terms of economics, in the Union and the South, they both try to do the same thing. They try to raise taxes and tariffs. That's how you pay for a war, is you get more money coming in to pay for this extra expense. It works in the North, not so much in the South. In the North, they have the benefit of the National Bank, which is one of those things that Congress passed while the South wasn't involved in Congress. They issue paper money that pretty much holds its value, and they're able to sell war bonds to help support the war effort. In the South, they try to do those tariffs. That's taxes that companies or countries pay on goods that come into that country or go out from that country. But the blockade that Lincoln ordered cuts off almost all tariff money because the South isn't able to trade. Also, those states that Jefferson Davis is having trouble getting to cooperate, they also don't want to pay taxes to Davis's government. They also issue paper money, but because of inflation, the paper money is made basically worthless. In the Union, they're also going to build new factories. A new class of people are going to appear called millionaires. I've never been part of that class, but I sure would like to try it. Some manufacturers are going to rip off the military, and this is something I had talked about in class, was that in almost all government situations, everything that we use, including like bridges that we drive over or under, are all made by whoever makes it the cheapest. If we need a bridge, oftentimes they'll set out a bid, say, we need you to tell us how much it'll cost for you to build this. And whoever comes in the cheapest, they get the job. Sometimes those companies come in too cheap. They say that they can make it for cheaper than they actually can. So then they have to make the thing worse with worse material to cut cost to be able to make money. And that's what happens in some cases with union manufacturers. They are making the stuff, but they're making it so cheaply that it's almost unusable sometimes. The South, which was going to rely on cotton, cannot rely on cotton. The South was leading in 3 things. They were leading in cotton production, mules and donkeys, and slaves. Now, cotton is gone. They have to try to figure out how to win the war with these 2 things: mules and donkeys and slaves. This is an example of inflation. In 1860 in the South, this was the price of these things. If you were going to the store to get bacon, flour, sugar, coffee, tea, lard, butter, meal, candles, and soap, it would cost you $6.45. 3 years later, that same stuff would cost you 10 times as much, which means a lot of people just can't afford it. From a foreign perspective, the ruling class kind of wants the South to win the Civil War, but the people in these other countries do not. They say, how can you possibly want the South to win? Have you read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Have you heard about the bad things that are happening to the slaves down there? Can you really look me in the face and say that that's a good thing that they win? So governments like Britain say, we'd like to help you, but we can't, because if we do, we could get riots. African Americans are going to join the Northern Army, but even in this situation, in this scenario, they're not going to be given the same duties as white people. They're going to be kind of your support. They're going to be digging out the toilets. They're going to be setting up camp. They're not going to be the ones fighting at first. Eventually, they are. Because eventually, whenever you have those long supply chains that we talked about with, you're from Pennsylvania, but you're fighting in Mississippi and you need soldiers, and it's going to take a week, 2 weeks to get the soldiers rounded up and sent to you. You start looking around, you're like, we've got all these other guys that we could use. Why don't we just use them? By the end of the war, 180,000 African Americans are going to serve in the Union Army. When they would go in, oftentimes African American troops would be sent in as the people to free the slaves. Partially this was a commonality, but partially this was, see what we can do? Why don't you join us? You could help fight for a better tomorrow for you and your family. Now we get into the first battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run. First Battle of Bull Run. You see, people are telling Lincoln, you need to do something. You need to attack. Finally, he says, okay, there's a group of Confederate forces 30 miles away. Irwin McDowell, go. And people are excited. Irwin McDowell, as he marches his troops out of D.C., there are literally families that pack up a picnic lunch and go sit on the hillside to watch this battle. As they're watching this battle, one of the things that they might have seen is a cannonball fly through the air into the house of a guy named Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean, after the Battle of Bull Run, says, you know what, I am way too close to this. I need to get out of this. I need to move. And he moves to Pennsylvania. See more about him later on. The South wins and the North has to retreat back to Washington, D.C. The problem is behind them is all those families that brought their lunches and were sitting on the hill to watch the battle. And the Northern Army runs right through them. And the stories when they get back are horrible, which ends up being kind of a good thing. Because the Confederacy, they kind of get kind of cocky, like, man, we won this. We don't need anybody else. We got this. And people that might have signed up for the Army, they say, you know, why would I go help? Like, they got it. They're fine. They don't need me. They get kind of full of themselves. In the North, they're like, okay, we've got to do better. We can't let this kind of thing happen again. We've got to train harder. We got to have more men. We got to have them knowing what we're supposed to do. And they train more. So the loss helps the North. The victory hurts the South, which sounds kind of weird. Out in the West, which is going to be near the Mississippi River, we have the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson battles. Ulysses S. Grant is over there at this time. He's not yet in charge of the entire army. And he pretty easily takes Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in western Tennessee. And this gives us a little bit of cushion for the North. Because if your slave state is the boundary between Tennessee and Kentucky, remember Kentucky's a slave state fighting for the North. If that's the boundary and the South comes in and starts taking parts of Kentucky, then it would be really easy for Kentucky to say, you know what, let's just fight with them. But if we've got part of Tennessee, we could afford to lose some, and we still wouldn't be in Kentucky. We would just be losing what we've already gained. The Peninsular Campaign. McClellan is now in charge, and McClellan has been planning, and finally Lincoln says, you need to go do something. Go attack Richmond. McClellan says, okay, I've got an idea. I'm going to come around, instead of going straight down to Richmond, I'm going to come around this way and I'm going to sneak in this side. And as I'm doing that, you send some more guys this way to kind of take some of the heat off of me and we'll have it. Well, about the time that McClellan starts moving around here, his troops get siphoned off. They get sent somewhere else because, well, Stonewall Jackson is marching toward D.C. As McClellan gets off the boats onto land, Jeb Stuart, James Ewell Brown Stuart's cavalry is going to be riding circles around McClellan's army. McClellan, the guy that's so good, the guy that is very confident in what he can do, is literally getting ridden around by the Confederate cavalry. The 7 days battle, Robert E. Lee comes over to help reinforce, and he pushes McClellan back to the Atlantic Ocean. McClellan has to get back on to the boats and go away back up to where he was. They abandon the Peninsular Campaign, and Lincoln fires McClellan, opening the door for Ambrose Burnside. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. See you next time.